Hello, how's everyone been? It's been a while since we did one of these. Been busy getting my house built and building my daughter's house, and next week I start building the other daughter's house. But we ended with a study of the book of Galatians. Then it was rather a topical study, and um, teaching it now. To the congregation that I serve, Sehai Elohim, we have been going back um, and looking at a deeper context of the history, beginning with a question: what did Paul know? Now, if the phone is shaking, you'll have to excuse me. I'm holding it because all of my other stuff is still in the storage shed, so we're having to make do with what we have. But it's a very important question. What did Paul know? Who was Paul? Paul is very misunderstood. And Peter makes it a point in one of his epistles to say, the writings of Paul are difficult to understand. And he goes on to say that people will take his words and twist them to mean something other than what they mean. We have an example in Acts chapter 21, verse 38. The chief captain is talking to Paul and says, "Aren't you that Egyptian that before these days made an uproar and led out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" Did Paul ever do that? 39 says, but Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech you, suffer me to speak to the people." Okay? So here's this captain thinking that Paul was some kind of terrorist leader that had led people in an uproar and an insurrection and all this stuff. And Paul says, no, I'm a Jew from Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. Okay? But who was Paul? Paul, we also have to understand what was Paul's upbringing. And this is an important thing to understand because we let things like this slip by and we begin to mistake Paul for something. Okay? He says, chapter 22, verse 3, "I am verily, truthfully, a man which am a Jew. I am a Yehudi. I am from the southern kingdom of Judah." Okay, first of all, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet I was brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the Torah of the fathers. And I was zealous towards Elohim, as all of you are to this day. Okay? If we look at this from a Hebrew Aramaic perspective, he says, I was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel and taught the exactness of the Torah. Okay? In other words, he understood what those first 5 books had to say. And that is critically important. He had an understanding of that. Something else that we need to keep in mind, and let's see, turn the page here. It is in chapter 23 of Acts when Paul is talking to the Sanhedrin. Okay, chapter 6 says, "But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other side were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, 'Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question.'" Okay? When he said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection, the Sadducees did not. Okay? What did Paul do? Paul, having been a Pharisee, understood the dangers of doctrine. And what he did was he set these two groups at odds with each other over their doctrinal beliefs. It's our doctrinal beliefs. It's our doctrinal beliefs that get in the way of our understanding what the word of our Elohim truly has to say. Okay, I attended seminary, and I have dual doctorates in theology and theological education. When I attended seminary, they taught us theology. That theology wasn't really based on what the Bible had to say as much as it was based on what the doctrines of that particular denomination had to say. In this case, it was a Baptist seminary, so the views were very much Baptist. Okay, hermeneutics, biblical interpretation. Didn't deal with looking at the Bible to see what it said. It dealt with looking at the Bible to try to get it to agree with whatever doctrines that particular denomination held. Doctrines, okay? And it's the doctrines of any denomination, whether it be Christian denomination or a Jewish denomination, that will blind us to understanding what the word of Elohim actually has to say. This is the difference between the 12 apostles. Had to switch hands there. I'm out here in the yard and we just mowed, so there's kind of all kinds of itchies all over the place, but it's a wonderful thing. But the apostles, we look at the apostles, the 12 apostles of Yahusha, and say, oh, they were so pious and all this and that. But they were pretty much stuck in Jewish mode. They were called to find and minister to the lost sheep of the house of Israel in the southern kingdom. But they couldn't let go of Judaism enough to be able to do that effectively. Paul, on the other hand, was a devout Jew, okay? A Pharisee, been brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, learning the exactness of the Torah. You'd have figured that he would have been very stuck in what's called takanot. We talked about takanot in our discussion of Galatians. Takanot, rabbinical decrees, the rabbinical interpretation of what a verse says, just like the church fathers' interpretation of what the Bible says. But what happened to Paul? On the road to Damascus, he's knocked to the ground and he goes blind. And he ends up at the house of Annas. And after washing his face, scales fall from his eyes. In other words, the deceptions of the serpent fall away. He loses any sight of doctrine, and now he's simply looking at truth. Okay? So what did Paul know? What did Paul know? He understood very clearly that the children of Israel were chosen because one man was righteous. They were chosen because Abraham obeyed and sought Elohim and sought a relationship with Elohim and became a friend of Elohim. He came into covenant with Elohim. We read about this in Genesis. And then through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have the children of Israel. Okay? Now, they are led by Moses to Mount Sinai. And I'll paraphrase it because it's kind of difficult to move pages around in the Bible and try to talk at the same time and hold the camera. I've got this part memorized, so It's in chapter 19 of Exodus, where Yahuwah speaks to Moses and says, "Tell the children of Israel, if you will hear, if you will shema, if you will perceive, discern, and understand my voice, if you will perceive, discern, understand, obey, apply, and be content in what I tell you, and you will guard, if you will shamar my covenant." In other words, shamar also means treasure. If you will treasure your relationship with me based on my word, my instruction, my voice, then you will be to me a special treasure. You will be my special treasure, says Elohim. And I will make you a nation of Kohanim. You will be a kadosh nation, not a holy nation. Ooh, divinity, you'd be so divine and everything. People will argue this into the ground, but there's really not a word for holy in Hebrew. The concept of divinity doesn't exist in Torah. Kadosh means to be set apart to a specific purpose. You will be a nation that is set apart to a specific purpose, and you will be a nation of Kohanim. Now, it's translated as priests, but priest really doesn't cut it. Kohanim, you will be a nation of ministers and teachers. Okay? What was Israel, as the children of Israel, the whole of Israel, both kingdoms combined, what was their mission? Their mission was to go out to the nations and to teach the nations about Yahuwah Elohim and bring the world back into balance. Okay? So that's the first thing. What happened? Moses dies, Joshua takes over, and we read in Joshua that while Joshua led them, they did exactly this. They followed the instruction of Elohim. They kept Torah. They followed the Torah. They sought to keep their relationship with Elohim. To the point that they're wanting to stray here and they're wanting to stray there. And Joshua tells them, you do whatever you want to do, but as for me and my house, we will serve Yahuwah. Okay? So Joshua dies, and we go into the point of the judges. Now, the judges plays a very important role in understanding Paul. Not really going to go too deeply into that. What I want to consider is the last couple of verses in Judges that said there was no king, and everyone did what was pleasing in their own eyes. Okay? Yahuwah Elohim was the king of Israel. The whole of Israel, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, were the kingdom of the heavens. It was the kingdom of Elohim, and Elohim was the king. Okay? Now, I'm going to touch on this very briefly. You can go and read about it yourself. There's a little issue that takes place with a prostitute, and Benjamin somehow is implicated in a very bad way, and this is in Judges, to the point where the other tribes of Israel say, we will not have anything to do with Benjamin. We will not intermarry with Benjamin. We will have nothing to do with them, that they die off the face of the earth. And it came to the point where Benjamin came very close to disappearing. Okay? And I don't use the word salvation very often, because salvation is a term that is far different than what deliverance is, what restoration means, what redemption is. But when you have a house that's on fire, you spray water on it trying to save the house. You want to save something, okay, whether you have valuables inside. Benjamin is in a very bad state. They're about to disappear. They are about to go extinct. And the other tribes take pity on them. But pride doesn't allow them to turn over their daughters to Benjamin for them to procreate and survive. So they come up with something. There's a annual party at Shiloh where maidens from all the tribes show up and they dance and go off with whoever comes and takes them by the hand. So the sons of Benjamin show up, and here they are able to go and take wives from amongst the tribes of Israel. Okay? And the result is that Benjamin survives, and Benjamin becomes one of the three tribes that ends up in Judah. Okay? Paul was from the house of Benjamin. Therefore, Paul would represent all of the tribes of Israel. Okay? Very important that we understand this. What else did Paul know? Paul also knew that corruption had fallen into the judges, the prophets. Although Eli was a pious man, we read in 1 Samuel, his sons were corrupt. Okay, so the prophets, the judges had become corrupted. Okay, and there was it was not necessarily in the sense of idolatry, but it was in a sense of doing it for personal gain. Okay, Samuel becomes the prophet. He becomes the judge. Okay, now we move forward a few years. Samuel is now in charge, and the people come to Samuel and say, "We want a flesh and blood king. We want to be like the nations. Give us a flesh and blood king." And Samuel's very distraught. He tries to talk them out of it. But Yahuwah tells Samuel, don't freak out. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So here we have where the people reject Yahuwah Elohim as king and place a human being on the throne. They end up with a guy that's chasing donkeys around, okay? Saul. Then David. Now David is not perfect. David has his issues. The thing about David is that unlike Saul, he's not power hungry, as power hungry as Saul. You know, David was still power hungry. He was a warmonger, and he loved to invade surrounding areas. But David had a tendency to look at what he'd done, repent, and try to turn away from it. One of the deals was with Uriah. He killed Uriah to take Bathsheba. Bathsheba ends up giving birth to Solomon, who would be the next king. Solomon starts off good, prays for wisdom and understanding, but in the end goes off and marries all kinds of wives from all kinds of idolatrous nations, contrary to Torah. And the result is that things fall into disarray. He would later write Ecclesiastes, which would be kind of his teshuvah for the whole thing. But we have to understand something about Solomon. Again, we can't look at these biblical figures as, oh, they were so wonderful and pious and loving and kind and all this stuff. Switching hands again here. Solomon was a tyrant, and he conscripted. He used slave labor from Edom to build the temple, but he also placed the northern kingdom of the house of Israel under forced labor. Okay, the Hebrew uses the word abed. That means they were slaves, almost treated like slaves, but they weren't slaves. They couldn't be slaves because they were Israelites. So Solomon dies. Okay, and this is what Paul knew. We have to understand what Paul knew in order for us to be able to understand. I'm giving you this because we're going to consider the prince of the book of Ezekiel. We have to have a background to understand the prince of Ezekiel. So this is just a background historical thing. Rehoboam takes over as king of Israel. Okay. Now, Rehoboam's older counselors tell them to let up on the slack on the house of Israel. Let up on the northern kingdom. Be kind to them. Make them your friends, and they will serve you well. Rehoboam's young advisors say, no, you have to be harder than you've been. Be worse than your father ever was. Treat them even harder than your father ever treated them. Rehoboam, unfortunately, goes with the latter of the two. Okay? Now, Jeroboam, who was basically a supervisor, had been placed in a very high position of supervising the tribes in this, specifically the tribe of Joseph, meets a prophet of Elohim and is told, Yahuwah will grant you the kingdom. You can take 10 tribes of the kingdom as long as you also take the tribe of Judah because for the sake of David. And if you will serve me, I will be your Elohim, and we can move forward. Because, I mean, if we lose a couple of tribes along the way, I'm still keeping my promise to Abraham. So Jeroboam almost goes for it until he has this conversation with Rehoboam. And the problem is that Jeroboam doesn't like what Rehoboam has to say. The result is that the kingdoms split. Now you have the southern kingdom of the house of Judah, and you have the northern kingdom of the house of Israel. And the northern kingdom of the house of Israel totally and completely falls into idolatry. So much to the point that in the book of Hosea and also in the book of Jeremiah, Yahuwah tells them, I am no longer your husband, you are no longer my wife, I divorce you. Now, if we understand the Torah, if we understand the book of Leviticus, once a husband divorces a wife, because that wife goes and marries another, she cannot return to the house of the first husband unless that first husband dies, and then a son from that husband's house can redeem her. Okay? So, later, a few verses later in Hosea, Elohim tells the house of Israel, although I have divorced you, I will bring you back. Okay? Because he loved Ephraim. He loved the house of Israel. But in order for us to have a kingdom of Elohim, we have to have both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom have to be one kingdom. Okay? And Paul understood this. Paul knew this. Okay? So that is the background that we have to grasp. Paul is having a conversation with Agrippa in Acts chapter 26. I think it's verse, I want to say somewhere between 26 and 28. Okay? That Agrippa tells Paul, you almost convinced me to be a Christian. And we all get so excited. Oh, use the word Christian in the New Testament. And Paul's about to convince this King Agrippa to be a Christian and all this other stuff. Because, yeah, you can be a Christian. All you have to do is get baptized, right? The thing is, that's not what it says. Agrippa says to Paul, you're almost convincing me to be a kratanos. You're almost convincing me to be gullible. And Paul says, I wish to Elohim that not only you, but that all that hear me this day would be gullible enough to understand what I'm saying. Okay? That being said, if Agrippa is a Roman, would he be eligible? Let's use the word eligible. It's probably the wrong word. To be part of the combined kingdom of Judah and Israel. Well, we read in the Torah that the Torah applies to the children of Israel and the stranger that resides among them. So if he were to begin to keep Torah, to follow Torah, to build that relationship with Elohim based on his instruction, he would be eligible to be part of that kingdom. I'm going to leave it at this for now, and we will begin taking a look at how this applies to the prince in the book of Ezekiel. Now I'm going to leave you with this. The word for prince in the book of Ezekiel is not sar, it's nasi. Nasi means something that has been raised up, something that has been renewed, something that has been repaired, something that has been lifted up. Okay? And it doesn't refer to Yahusha. I'll leave you with that, and I look forward to our next study. I'm glad that I'm finally able to get out here and do these videos again. I miss doing them, and if you're in my Saturday class, I miss you dearly. Say Hi Elohim has started up again, but until next time, look over all this stuff, and I encourage you to read 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. I encourage you to read the minor prophets, and I encourage you to read Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Alrighty, we shall see you soon, and I look forward to another lecture soon. Goodbye.